When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time." See, this is where he's really going above and beyond what was necessary. Boaz is, I guess, one of those somewhat rare people in the Bible that is, wealthy and well off, but also still, is generally a good person. What's up, cool people? My name is Matt. Welcome back to our Bible study. Okay, now we're looking at Ruth chapter 2. So, Naomi / Mara, I think it's still going to refer to her as Naomi, but she and her husband and sons moved away from Israel to live in Moab because of famine. Her husband and sons died there in Moab, but the Moabite wives of her sons were still alive. They had then heard that, things were good in Judah again. Naomi, of course, wanted to go back because she didn't have any male family members in Moab to help care for her. So she wanted to head back, but she didn't think it would be a good idea for her daughters-in-law to go with her because odds are they'd have a better chance of finding new husbands in Moab than in Israel. Orpah, her one daughter-in-law, eventually concedes and goes back to Moab, but Ruth decides to stick with her. So now Ruth and Naomi are both living in Israel, specifically around Bethlehem, and it's at this point about the time of the barley harvest, was what it said at the end of the last chapter. So, here we go. Time to get into Ruth chapter 2. Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband Elimelech. One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go out into the harvest fields and pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it." Naomi replied, "All right, my daughter, go ahead." So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters, and as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law Elimelech. So, I don't know if it was necessarily required all the time to leave grain behind. This was in the time of Judges, so depending on where in that progression, people might not exactly have been following God's commands super closely anyway. I believe there was a command that said, no, they should leave, grain and whatever crops behind in the fields that just happened to drop off the stalks or whatever was left over that hadn't been harvested, basically, leave that for widows and the poor and whoever else might have really desperately needed food to get by and didn't necessarily have another way of providing for themselves. But there's really no guarantee of that, especially for an outsider, essentially, like Ruth was. But she figures that's at least one possible way to, gather the grain and get some food for her and Naomi. So Naomi's all good with it. Ruth happens to, do this in a field that belongs to Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So he's a possible candidate for, next of kin considerations as far as, marrying Ruth would be concerned. But we'll get to that a bit later. Okay, verse 4. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you," he said. "The Lord bless you," the harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman, "Who's that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?" And the foreman replied, "She's the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter." Okay, so it's not stated exactly how the foreman knew this, but he, through some way or another, knew that Ruth was, Naomi's daughter-in-law, I guess. Or at least that she was a companion of Naomi. So with the connection between Naomi and Boaz, essentially, I guess that means Boaz would have been... It just says he was a relative, not the exact familial relation to Elimelech. I was about to say, maybe that Boaz was his brother, but it doesn't say that outright. But anyway, so Ruth is working hard out in these fields trying to, gather grain, whatever's there behind the harvesters. Not taking anything from them that they would have wound up gathering themselves, but gathering her own grain behind them from what's left. So basically, Boaz asks about her, the foreman tells Boaz, and then we get to verse 8. Boaz went over and said to Ruth, "Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting, and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly, and when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well." Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly. "What have I done to deserve such kindness?" she asked. "I'm only a foreigner." Yeah, but I think Boaz understands that there's a connection there, and, he says he was wealthy and influential, so I'm sure he had some resources to spare, and wanting to be kind to someone who is at least in some way connected to his family. He's wanting to help, because it would potentially be more of a risk then for her to go to other people's fields where she might not be welcome. But he may or may not get into that later. For now, let's move on to verse 11. So, Ruth had asked, what she did to deserve this, and that she's just a foreigner. So then Boaz replies in verse 11. "Yes, I know," Boaz replied. "But I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done." So, he also is sympathetic to her because of, her willingness to stick with Naomi and the risk that she took there. So, now that he's stated some of his reasoning, we get to verse 13. "I hope I continue to please you, sir," she replied. "You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers." At mealtime, Boaz called to her, "Come over here and help yourself to some food." You can dip your bread in the sour wine." So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time." See, this is where he's really going above and beyond what was necessary. Because, like, well, first off, he didn't have to invite her, to a meal. He also didn't have to intentionally let more grain be available for her, but he's doing so. So, Boaz is, I guess, one of those somewhat rare people in the Bible that is, wealthy and well off, but also still, is generally a good person. There's a lot of rich people we hear about in the Bible who aren't so great people. Boaz is not like those others, though. Not saying that it's completely unheard of, because, you get some people like King David or King Solomon or, even Job, one might argue, who were well off and, were still good people and even generally worshiped God and followed the law pretty closely. But anyway, maybe it's because of Naomi's situation that he's extra sympathetic to Ruth. In any case, let's go to verse 17. So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal. "Where did you gather all this grain today?" Naomi asked. "Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you." So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said, "The man I worked with today is named Boaz." Okay. The footnote there at basket, Hebrew says it was about an ephah, 20 quarts or 22 liters. So, picture like a 5-gallon bucket, but, in probably like woven basket form. That is apparently how much grain that she was able to leave with. And the assumption is that this all took place over the course of a single day. Because there's no mention of transitions of days in the midst of any of this. So, Naomi seems pleasantly surprised by all this, and obviously is grateful for it. So then after Ruth tells Naomi that she was in Boaz's field, then we get to verse 20. "May the Lord bless him," Naomi told her daughter-in-law. "He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers." Then Ruth said, "What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed." "Good," Naomi exclaimed. "Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him." Okay, so she said it, not Boaz. But anyway, so Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law. Alright, so text-wise, that does it for the end of the chapter. We have some footnotes to look at, and I have a couple of thoughts before we totally wrap things up. But, So I thought I had remembered somebody mentioning to Ruth that, she might get in trouble, or in this case, harassed, to use the word here, in other people's fields. I just hadn't remembered that it was Naomi who said that. I thought maybe it was Boaz. Anyway. So the whole family redeemer concept was something I kind of talked about, at least conceptually, in the last chapter, regarding the whole kind of next of kin idea, and basically the way that the Israelites would have determined who should be the next one to have the ability to marry, a man's widow. So that it's saying he's one of their family redeemers, not saying that he's the only one, but he, I guess, would be pretty early in the line of progression, so to speak, for someone who would potentially be able to then marry Ruth and carry on, the name, the legacy of Ruth's, at this point, deceased husband. The one that was Naomi's son. So, that is kind of relevant to the whole situation. I mean, also just confirms the family connection that was there all the more, and a possible reason why Boaz was being so nice. Or he could have also been a nice person just in general, but I'm sure the family connection added all the more motivation for him. Anyway, footnotes. Hebrews says to the living and to the dead. So I guess it would then read like he is showing his kindness to us as well, to the living and the dead, which would possibly, I guess, refer again to the familial connection, and that, even though the direct relation there was through those who had passed, he's still wanting to help the living relatives of those who had passed, who were directly connected to him. Something to that effect. Anyway, and then this footnote. Hebrews says Ruth the Moabite specifically, but, I don't think that needs to be specified here. I guess maybe that would have just put extra emphasis on the fact that, at least to him, she was a foreigner. There was no direct connection there. But, despite that, Boaz was still choosing to be kind and not only help her out that day, but ensuing days afterward. Apparently through the entire barley harvest and even the wheat harvest after that. And maybe even beyond that, but that's all the further we've gotten in chapter 2. So, that wraps it up for this chapter and my thoughts on it. Alright, so Ruth has found a field to harvest crops and whatnot. Apparently, it belongs to Boaz, who's a relative, or at least kind of a relative indirectly of Naomi. He was actually related to Naomi's, husband, but, That husband is now dead, so there's all sorts of complicating things going on with all that. But anyway, it seems like Ruth and Naomi are fairly well set, all things considered. So, that's where we leave things off for now. As always, like and share if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell if you're on YouTube to get updates when I post new videos. Wherever else you might find this, feel free to follow and do whatever you need to on that channel to keep up with my latest activities. Look down in the description wherever you find this to get info on other social media pages, to keep even more up to date with my activities across all social media stuff. And down below everything, leave comments with whatever thoughts you have. So, that'll do it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you soon for another video. Whatever the case is, till next time, stay cool, people.